It's the morning of March 16th, 1978, a bit before 9 a.m. in Rome. There's a man driving this car and a bodyguard, and a third man in the back seat who's on his way to the Church of Santa Chiara, where he goes every morning before attending to the day's work. This is a time when Italy is stricken with political violence and terrorism, but this man plays an important role in trying to achieve some stable political paradigm that might someday lead to cooler heads prevailing. He is the primary architect of the historic compromise, a unique accord between the ruling Christian Democrats and the surging Italian Communist Party that, in the midst of the Cold War, defies all global pressure and precedent. And of course, there are more than a few people who are not happy about it. This man has made the same commute almost every day for the last 15 years, so nobody's too surprised to look up from their morning paper and see the most important man in the nation ride past. Old Italian folk wisdom dictates that the truly powerful are untouchable, but in the days prior, this man has had some reason to be afraid. Prominent terrorist groups have identified the Christian Democrats as their primary enemy, and as party president, no other man is so closely identified with the post-war Italian government as he. A cautious observer may have noticed that in the days prior, unfamiliar cars have been driving up and down his street. Were you to have run their plates, you would have found that they were forged or stolen. This man's driver, who has headed his personal security for the last 15 years, has recently requested a bulletproof vehicle in response to a surge in targeted political violence, but that request was summarily rejected. The cars proceed down Via Mario Fani towards Via Stresa, where some illegally parked cars narrow their lane. As they approach the intersection, a wayward white Fiat backs through it into their car, and they collide, and the escort car rear-ends them. A man and woman exit the Fiat, but that's where the pretense ends. As they approach the car, more men dressed in airline uniforms emerge from a nearby courtyard, and they all brandish Scorpion machine pistols. Within 15 seconds, more than 100 rounds are fired, and the guards are all gunned down. There's only one survivor. They take him and put him in one of the parked cars, and the three Fiats pull away, leaving the street in stunned silence. The kidnappers have cut the phone lines to the block, but they know their time is limited. They take a left on Via Stresa and loop back onto Via Trionfale, where they head southeast before turning sharply onto a sparse private street. A chain blocks passage, but the woman cuts it, and they transfer the man to a white van. The van is equipped with lights and sirens, which they cut on. They speed southwest and are last seen heading towards the Via Aurelia, a road built thousands of years ago to carry Roman legions out to the sea. The plan of the kidnappers has worked flawlessly, and Aldo Moro, godfather of the modern Italian state, is in the hands of Brigate Rosse, the Red Brigades. It was a time when killers and terrorists on either end of the political spectrum used what few levers of power they had to try and derail the nation from its course toward the center. Even half a century later, the era is shrouded in uncertainty as to who killed whom, which side blew up which train, what foreign power was embedded with which faction, and whose interests were ultimately being served. The kidnapping of Aldo Moro was neither the beginning nor the end, but it was the apex of 2 decades of terror. Anni di Piombo, the years of lead. So here we are in 1978 in the midst of another traumatic chapter in Italian political history. But if we're going to understand this, we need to step back through the events to the dawn of time. No, I'm just kidding. We're not doing all that. We're going back to 1969, November 19th in Milan, where a young man has just died. We're in the midst of what will later be called the Hot Autumn, where an increasingly conscious student body is combined with the class-conscious body of workers in the cities of northern Italy to agitate for change. See, in the time since Mussolini got dangled and the war ended, Italy had undergone a rapid economic and industrial modernization. But workers' conditions in northern factories were still poor, and so this hot autumn represented the explosion of sentiments held by a working class that was increasingly unified by communism. And in one violent clash, a 22-year-old police officer named Antonio Annaruma was killed when he was hit by a steel pipe. This is generally considered to be the first death of the years of lead, and it opened the door to an age of violence that spanned the length and sort of even defied the idea of the political spectrum. So in response to leftist agitation and increasing representation of socialism and communism in Italian government, there's an outbreak of extreme violence from the far right, like when neo-fascists bomb a major bank in Milan the next month, killing 17. The plan of the far right was to stage terrorist attacks that implicated the far left, which would then empower the government to stage an authoritarian crackdown on leftist movements and protesters. To a greater or lesser extent, this was done with collaboration with the Italian Secret Service agencies and through Operation Gladio, also the CIA probably, but that's still being sorted out. Right after these bombings in December, which we know were almost definitely done by a neo-fascist group called Ordine Nuovo, or New Order, Italian police cracked down on some anarchists and in particular blamed a man named Giuseppe Pinelli, a rail worker and father of two. Within 2 days, Pinelli was arrested and dead from a fall from a police station window, presumably thrown out by the cops. This was the strategy of tension. Collaboration between right-wing terrorists and government agencies to cyclically incite leftist anger, implicate left-wing organizations in false flag operations, and empower the state to grow more authoritarian. It becomes strikingly apparent that the police are willing and able to bash peaceful left-wing protests, but utterly powerless to stop bombings from these right-wing terror groups. But that's 1969. By 1978, a lot has changed. So Aldo Moro is in the van, last seen headed southwest. For all of 47 minutes, the kidnappers have freedom of movement to get to the people's prison and bunker down. After that, all of Rome is locked down with checkpoints everywhere. So wherever they got to, it's somewhere in here. At 10:12 a.m., the phone rings in the La Repubblica newspaper office, and it's the Red Brigades. They're claiming responsibility for the kidnapping. They don't make any demands. So, who are they, and what do they want? So let's go back to August of 1970. Margherita Kagel, Renato Curcio, and Alberto Franceschini are sociology students at the University of Turin who have been up there in the cauldron of left-wing politics with students and workers. They exist to the left of the Italian communists who they view as being too willing to cooperate with the ruling Christian Democrat Party, and they merge some of the other hard-left factions of workers and students together with a mandate to go to any means necessary to realize the vision of a workers' revolution. Starting from the late 60s, Italy's been getting ripped up by terrorist attacks, first from the far right and then later primarily from the far left. Bombings, assassinations, robberies, and kidnappings are rocking the foundation of the country, but Italian politicians are initially slow to formulate any kind of organized response, largely because they're scared that they'll be implicated in plots if the truth about these strategy of tension bombings comes out. Eventually, though, as sympathy for these factions on the right dwindles and their soldiers are killed or arrested, these factions die off, and it's the far-left Red Brigades and the like who pose the greater danger. Especially noteworthy for our purposes are the events of April 1974. A Genoese prosecutor named Mario Sossi has been hunting the Red Brigades when, on one afternoon, he gets off the bus standing on the street corner and he's snatched off the street and thrown in the back of a van. "You've been looking for the Red Brigades," a voice says to him. "Well, you found them." Sossi is taken to a farmhouse 40 miles north of Genoa and he's imprisoned for 34 days. A people's trial condemns him to death, but the Red Brigades agree to exchange him for 8 members of another far-left terror organization. They release Sossi, but at the last minute the courts change their mind and refuse to free the 8 prisoners. This can be seen as 2 things. First, a harsh awakening for the Red Brigades and their mission to enter into further legitimate negotiations with the state, and second, a dry run for a far more ambitious project. Okay, we got something coming in. Reporters have just been informed that there's a photo of Moro left in an old photo booth in an underpass by the Largo Argentina Square. Moro's alive, propped in front of the banner of the Red Brigades. In response, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti makes the announcement. The heads of the 5 parties that make up the Italian government are to assemble at Palazzo Chigi to decide how to handle the Moro Affair. This historically unique government of Christian Democrats, socialists, communists, and more must now deliberate on the fate of the man who stitched them all together. This unique coalition was largely the work of 2 men, Aldo Moro and Enrico Berlinguer. In the 1970s, there were really 2 bastions of political power in Italy, the centrist Christian Democrats and the Italian Communist Party. Since the war ended, the Democrazia Cristiana, or DC, had essentially ruled Italy as a mono-party. A lot of the fighting and dying in the war to free Italy from fascism in the 1940s was done by communists, but they were largely excluded from government due to international fear of the spread of communism. But when one party rules for a long time without competition, they get stagnant and corrupt, and the people agitate for change. In contrast, the Italian Communist Party modeled itself as the party of clean hands, which carried itself morally and efficiently, and it was becoming increasingly popular. In 1972, the DC won 38% of the votes, while the Communists won 27%, and in 76, the DC won 38%, while the Communists rose to 34%. The Christian Democrats were helmed by a few different leaders over the years who occupied the position of prime minister or president or party chair, but essentially it was the party of Aldo Moro, even if he wasn't always sitting in the big chair. On the other side was the red aristocrat, Enrico Berlinguer, who found the works of Marx in his uncle's library and rose to popularity and success as the face of European communism. It was a strange historical moment for communism. Adherents of the schools of Lenin and Mao maintained that there could be no compromise, no revisionism, no cooperation with the institutes of capitalism and liberal democracy. But in the Italian Communist headquarters at the Street of Dark Shops, Berlinguer and his associates had spent years pondering the possibility of entering into governance with the Christian Democrats, leveraging parliamentary power to realize some of their goals without picking up the rifle. On the fringes and in the shadows, fascism still churned, and those in the center and on the left feared that the global economic crises and strategy of tension bombings were yielding fertile ground for its return. In Aldo Moro, icon of the left-leaning faction of Christian Democrats, the communists saw a man with whom they could work, banding together to stonewall Italian fascism as they had in the 1940s. Under the withering gaze of Washington and of Moscow, who both staunchly opposed it, Moro and Berlinguer led millions of their followers into the historic compromise, where fundamentally different ideologies cohabited in government. Around the margins of the fragile armistice, domestic and global partisans maneuvered to defeat it. Back in Rome, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti has assembled the A-team, the heads of each of the 5 parties. You've got Benigno Onestzack Zaccagnini for the Christian Democrats, Enrico Berlinguer for the Communists, Bettino Craxi for the Socialists, Otto Biasini for the Republicans, and Luigi Romita for the Social Democrats. And they're all like, okay, what are we going to do about this Moro thing? And I don't know exactly how this decision got made, but they all leave that meeting with nerves of steel, utterly resolved not to negotiate with the terrorists for the release of Moro, no matter what. They say, "We feel bad he got snatched up like that, but we're not going to start releasing other terrorists. We're not going to legitimize this group. So Moro is just dug in with these dudes somewhere in a box." And it's not really clear what's going to happen because the Red Brigades haven't even said what they want yet. In addition to the three founding members of the Red Brigades, Franceschini, Curcio, and Kagel, a fourth leader emerged early on, Mario Moretti, the head of the column in Milan. In these early days, they build up in the northern cities and they start relatively small, taking targeted ideological actions to further the interests of the working class. When they firebomb the cars of factory managers or kidnap capitalist bosses, their actions resonate with the working class that they seek to inspire towards revolution. However, over the years, this highly ideological mission is diluted. The biggest shift comes in mid-1974, when a man named Silvano Gerato enters the scene. Gerato, also known as Brother Machine Gun, was an Italian priest who'd been sent to Bolivia as a missionary, where he'd picked up the rifle and fought with the Latin communists against the Suarez regime. When he was wounded, he was sent back to Italy, where he witnessed how his country had descended into political violence. In Bolivia, he'd witnessed the struggle for life and death, but in the Red Brigades, he merely saw violent adventurers with itchy trigger fingers who struggled to articulate any specific cause. In the autumn of 1974, he contacted the Red Brigades under the pretext of wanting to join. When he met with Franceschini and Curcio, he brought the police with him, and in one afternoon, the Red Brigades were beheaded by the capture of its two leading operators. The next year in 1975, Curcio would be freed by a bold prison break led by his wife, Margarita Kagel, but only months later, Kagel would be killed in a shootout with the police. Compounding that victory was the recapture of Renato Curcio and Franceschini after the police received a tip on where he was hiding out. Fascinatingly, both Curcio and Franceschini believe, and still maintain to this day, that the tipster that betrayed them was Mario Moretti, who they identified as a CIA spy. Whether that's true, I don't know, and we probably never will know the truth, but whatever the truth was, the death of Kagel and the arrest of Curcio and Franceschini meant that it was this mysterious fourth face who was at the top of the formation. Under Moretti, the Red Brigades entered a new phase of violence as they sought to rally the fighting Communist Party together and kickstart widespread radical action. As the 1970s progressed and the first generation of brigatistas and leaders fell, their message was diluted by the recruitment of disaffected, angry, violent youths from the desperately poor ghettos of Rome and Milan. Many of them donned a new motto, La storia ci uccide, history kills us. Others quoted from Mao, there is great chaos under heaven, thus the situation is excellent. As the decade ticked on, in the haze of tear gas, the Red Brigades believed that the time of the revolution was almost at hand. They no longer held violence in reserve, nor did they orient themselves to align with workers. They were chaotic and rampant. That's not to say they were ineffective. Their operation on Via Fani demonstrated surprising operational effectiveness, requiring the cooperation of dozens of brigatistas. They maintained rigid organizational standards for their members, and their structure mirrored the most effective militaries and guerrilla organizations in the world, with each cell operating under a central structure but remaining ignorant of the work of all other cells. It wasn't a question of if they could reliably hit their targets. It was a question of if they could pick the right ones, and what they would do once they did. In the kidnapping of Aldo Moro, the dog had finally caught the mailman. Aldo Moro wants to live even if his political allies wish that he would allow himself to die. It was his role as a negotiator between the Christian Democrats and the Italian Communist Party that made him so emblematic of what the Red Brigades hate the most, the international order and the revisionist communists willing to coexist with it. It was this alliance that Moro had forged which now formed an ironclad line that utterly rejected negotiation for his freedom. From the People's Prison, Moro learns of the Parliament's hardline, and he knows he's alone. He writes letters to family, friends, and one-time political allies, offering strategic guidance or pleading for empathy, letters that are passed to recipients by the Red Brigades themselves through secret channels, but many of which end up published in newspapers anyway. But maddeningly, his old friends in the Christian Democratic Party ultimately urge the public to ignore the letters. As though they come from the hand of Aldo Moro, they insist they're written under the duress of drugs and torture. Moro continues to insist on his clarity, but there's nothing he can say that will prove that he remains himself. In his letters, he wonders what it is that has driven his friends to leave him so alone. Through the early days of the Moro Affair, the hardline maintained the sheen of unanimity, but there were those whose loyalty to Moro, or whose empathy for his plight, oriented them toward a change. Eleonora Moro, a woman who for decades has been avoiding the public life, is now thrust in the center of a national trauma as she pushes, nearly alone, against the ironclad wall. Remember, the Red Brigades have made no specific demands, but preemptively, Andreotti, Berlinguer, and Zaccagnini have all rejected the concept of negotiation with this terrorist faction. At first, the Moro family is almost alone in its struggle, but as days tick by, cracks in the line begin to emerge. To this point, the Red Brigades have been non-committal in their communiques. They issued their first message shortly after the kidnapping, confirming that the prisoner was alive in the People's Prison, and another letter followed a week later which stated he was undergoing interrogation. The third letter comes on March 29th, 12 days into the affair, declaring that ongoing violent struggle against the state is the only way forward. They have not laid out any terms, but notably, they have allowed Moro to write letters speaking of a prisoner exchange. Every word he writes is delivered at their peril and is implicitly filtered through their consent, so there's a demonstration of some openness to this idea. This all passed very slowly. The Moro family is huddled together at their penthouse on Via Trionfale, watching the clock tick, waiting for anything to change. In the long hours and days, the plight of an old friend weighs on the mind of those who knew him. And underneath the surface of the hard line, facing the pressure of the withering letters of Aldo Moro and the maneuvers of his family, cracks do grow and sentiments change. The Vatican, as an institution, wants above all to support the Christian Democrats, and so they implicitly agree not to wedge themselves into negotiations. But Pope Paul VI holds his own counsel on this affair. On April 2nd, the 17th day, he issues an address directly, pleading with the men and women of the Red Brigades for the life of his friend. In so doing, he risks lending legitimacy to this faction, but he is a rare voice advocating for the prisoner. On its face, this is a political standoff on the merit of negotiating with terrorists, but beneath the surface, other forces are moving. In his small cell, Aldo Moro still wields authority. Even in captivity, as party president of the Christian Democrats, he has formal powers, and aside from that, as a person, he has innate influence over many. But as the days tick by and he fires off more letters which brigatistas secretly deliver in the dead of night, he finds that many of those who he counted as friends are utterly unflinching in opposition to negotiating for his life. On April 4th, the 19th day of his captivity, the Italian parliament is in session when a disruption ripples through the room. Another letter from Moro has arrived, this one directly addressing Zaccagnini. Moro reminds him that it was he who convinced him not to retire and to stay on as party president. He also reminds his party members that years earlier, he'd established the precedent of openness to prisoner for hostage exchanges, and that the notion that the Italian government would never negotiate with terrorists was simply an unfounded fabrication. Why then, Moro wonders, has my party decided to leave me adrift? Is it due to pressure from Germany or the United States? What are the motives guiding them? The pages of the letter ripple through Parliament until they reach Zaccagnini. Moro knows that his old friend is a morally upright man, to a fault, and he's applying every lever of psychological power he can reach from his cell to try and break the hard line and save his own life. The session ends and the Christian Democrat leaders gather. Andreotti and Interior Minister Cossiga, an old pupil of Moro's who's unexpectedly become a cornerstone of the hard line, try and soothe the discomfort of their party members by arguing that the letters were penned under the influence of drugs and torture. But Zaccagnini knows that they're not. Past a certain point, these men who adamantly refuse to negotiate cannot afford for Aldo Moro to come home safe. What happens to them if the godfather of the nation, on the waves of a messianic return from death, comes face to face with the men who condemned him? Though no one will say it, the fundamental principle of the hardline has changed, at least for the Christian Democrats. A refusal to negotiate has become a determined death sentence. The leaders of the Christian Democrats cannot see him come home. The Italian Communist Party has such total contempt for any extra-state entity to their left that they will never countenance any negotiation with the Red Brigades. And so it's only the socialists, a party in search of an identity, led by a man in search of a cause, who see promise in the fight to bring Aldo Moro home. But for now, the hard line remains unbroken. On April 15th, a new communique from the Red Brigades finally arrives. Aldo Moro has been sentenced to death and his execution is pending. Behind the curtain somewhere, the Brigatistas have spent weeks interrogating him. They intend to uncover dark secrets of a globalist conspiracy, but what they find is what everybody already knows about the Christian Democrats. They're ineffectual, they trade favors, they achieve little. Moro reveals that at heart, the Christian Democrats are simply more casually corrupt than conspiratorial. It's what comes 3 days later that stuns Italy. Communique 7 declares Aldo Moro is dead, his body dumped in Lake Duchessa. But this message is different. The paper's different. It's typed from a different typewriter, and moreover, as one mountaineer and communist leadership notes, it doesn't make sense. Lake Duchessa in April is a frozen lake atop a mountain 50 miles north of Rome. It would take a team of Sherpas and a pack of dynamite to haul a body up there and dump it in the lake. Even so, the Christian Democrats treat it like it's true, and hundreds of men are dispatched to the mountains to search for a body that isn't there. That same day, elsewhere in Rome, someone complains of a leak coming from their upstairs neighbor. The fire department enters and finds a shower head left running in an apartment full of guns, license plates, and paraphernalia. The police arrive, and as they scan through papers, they realize that they are in the hideout of Mario Moretti. From the top of this apartment on Via Gradoli, one could just make out the spot on Via Fani where Aldo Moro had been taken. But here, today, nobody's home. Who left the water running that day and why has never been determined. Was it an infiltrator? Was it a Brigatista opposed to Moretti's leadership? Was it done to distract from the false communique? Was the false communique issued to steal headlines from the Discovery? Who issued the false communique? As with many issues in this story, various allegations exist, but we will simply never know the fine details. The following days in late April are the messiest, as hundreds of searchers scour the mountain lake for the dead president on what is obviously a fool's errand. The government engages in a sort of pre-mourning for Moro, likely realizing that he's not dead, but hoping to predispose the public towards that expectation as though it's inevitable, when it's not. They have the power to prevent it. Far from being dead in a frozen lake 50 miles north, Aldo Moro could come home tomorrow if the Italian government said the word. On April 20th, a call is placed to a journalist, telling him to go to the rear entrance of a department store in Rome and look in a trash can. A message is recovered from the Red Brigades, a photo of Aldo Moro holding a newspaper that says, "Moro assassinated?" The real Communique 7 is attached, and for the first time the possibility of freeing Moro is explicitly addressed. The Brigatistas demand in no specific terms the release of far-left prisoners from Italian prisons. They offer the Christian Democrats a 48-hour window to signal interest in an exchange, or they will kill Aldo Moro. At this point, major Italian media outlets align with the hard line, but the public seems to disagree. polls find that 60% of Italians support probing negotiations, and sentiments spread from far-left presses suggesting that the Christian Democrats want Moro to come home in a casket so that they can champion his body in the elections 3 weeks away. Moro's most powerful friend, Pope Paul VI, covertly dispatches Don Angelo Curioni to the lawyer of the imprisoned Brigatistas, Eduardo de Giovanni, to gain an understanding of what it is that it'll take to bring Moro home. And far from any massive prisoner exchange, Curioni is surprised to learn the Red Brigades would be satisfied by a mere hint of political legitimacy. Opponents of negotiation in government touted that Moro's freedom would cost the release of dozens of violent terrorists, but now it's clear that a nod from the government, as minor as releasing a sick, nonviolent leftist prisoner or making an effort to improve the brutal prison conditions of imprisoned Brigatistas, would be enough to warrant the return of Moro. And yet, in Parliament, Moro's oldest friends remain steadfastly opposed to the negotiation. But his political cousins in the Italian Socialist Party finally unleashed their broadside with less than 24 hours remaining to save Aldo Moro. As Bettino Craxi exhorts the Parliament to take the small step needed to bring Moro home, a letter arrives, addressed again to Benigno Zaccagnini. Speaking with candor to a man he'd been friends with for decades, Moro asks what dark motivation prevents him from saving his life. If you do not intervene, Moro says, you will be writing a cold-blooded page in the history of Italy. My blood will fall on all of you, on the party, on the country. He reiterates that he only ever returned to politics because Zaccagnini pleaded with him to, and the life of Aldo Moro is now in the hands of Benigno Zaccagnini, an uncommonly upright, moral man in the corrupt world of Italian politics. So what is the merit of this anti-negotiation position? Enrico Berlinguer, cornerstone of the hardliners, says that negotiation with terrorists is equivalent to societal suicide, and that providing a victory to the Red Brigades will spur them on to more kidnappings and more killings. For the hardliners, it's a question of choosing between the life of a man and the life of the Republic. For Berlinguer and the communists, unflinching adherence to ideology, even in painful moments, was as simple and undeniable as breathing. But for Andreotti, Zaccagnini, and the Christian Democrats, the motivation is perhaps less clear. They publicly espouse the same motivation as the communists, but for a party whose commitment to ideals was less than famous, and whose unity had always been questionable, where did this unflinching unanimity come from? In long hours in a small cell, Moro had time to wonder. By now the 48 hours are nearly finished. It's the night of the 22nd, and in absence of any signal from the government, Moro may not survive to the morning. Finally, the suggestion of a concession is intimated by the Christian Democrats. They publicly announced that Caritas Internationalis, an international Catholic aid organization, will be tapped to facilitate the potential negotiations with the Brigatistas. It's not an offer. It's not even a commitment to attempt to negotiate. But for the first time in a while, the DC is not just sitting on their hands. It is difficult to know the conditions of the Red Brigades at this time. We know from some first-hand accounts that their unity was at its nadir during the Moro Affair, as some Brigatistas forecasted that executing their prisoner, who was a sympathetic paternal figure to the Italian people, would brand them as enemies and villains of the people they sought to unite. While others argued that releasing Moro in exchange for nothing, or continuing to bide their time indefinitely, would indicate that they lacked the will necessary to wage a people's revolution. Speaking to this tension, as the 48 hours expired, the Pope offered an address, appealing to the humanity and faith of the Red Brigades. He says he hopes that genuine social progress is their aim, and that if it is, they must not stain it with innocent blood. In so doing, the Pope offers them a degree of political legitimacy that the parliamentarians on the other side of the Tiber have to this point withheld. The ultimatum expires, and no one knows if Moro's dead or alive. Finally, after 2 further days, Communique 8 arrives. Moro remains alive, and the Brigatistas provide an initial negotiation position. the return of 13 prisoners of various leftist movements. The Christian Democrats unflinchingly categorically refuse the notion. Moro, sensing his impending demise, pens a letter to his former allies. He tells them the Christian Democrats are not welcome at my funeral, and it is you, not the Red Brigades, who are responsible for my death. The very next day, 75 old friends of Aldo, primarily old political allies and university colleagues, sign an open letter saying that under the duress of drugs and torture, the Moro penning the letters is not the real Moro. They declare that the guilt lies with the Red Brigades alone, and they condemn efforts to negotiate for his safe return. Moro, left desperately alone in his cell, wonders how such a thing could happen. Despite pressure from the socialists, the family of Moro, and the Pope, as April turns to May, the hard line remains. Secretary General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim, offers to play a role in facilitating Moro's freedom, but Italian authorities decline. Instead, Waldheim steps over them and, via satellite television, beams himself directly into the homes of Italy, speaking in Italian directly to the Brigatistas, and he makes 3 points. First, they've already succeeded in bringing attention to their cause. Second, continuing to hold Moro in limbo only damages their legitimacy. And third, freeing Moro would be applauded by the whole world and earn them considerable legitimacy. The Christian Democrats and Italian communists are outraged, fearing that, between international recognition from Waldheim and the Pope, they're on the brink of having a legitimized military organization running wild within their borders. Despite all international pressure, the answer of the Italian government remains an unflinching no. Moro pens increasingly frantic letters in the following days, vacillating between desperate attempts at new angles for negotiation and condemnation of the old friends who left him to die. In what sounds like goodbye, Moro writes to his family, "I do not want the men of power around me. I want near me those who truly loved me and will continue to love me and pray for me. If all of this is to be decided, let the will of God be done, but let no one responsible hide behind the fulfillment of a presumed duty. Things will be clear. They will all be clear soon. Aldo Moro." Flinching under a flurry of letters from Moro, in early May the hardline seems vulnerable. At an international meeting of socialist leader, Bettino Craxi confides in French Prime Minister that the position of the Christian Democrats is thus: first they wept because Aldo Moro was dead, then they wept because he was mad. Now, if he comes home, there will be one too many. On the night of the 3rd, the Red Brigades place a direct call to the Moro house and tell them that only an immediate break by Zaccagnini will prevent the imminent death of Aldo Moro in the coming hours. The Christian Democrats set a date for parliamentary discussion to reconsider the hard line. That date is May 18th, more than 2 weeks away. Craxi, the Moro family, and other allies hasten to do anything to forestall the imminent execution. An assembly of far-left groups politically adjacent to the Red Brigades urge them not to kill Moro, as his body would be used as a pretext for the state to become stronger and destroy the revolutionary sectors. On May 5th, day 51 of the affair, Communique 9 drops. They announce, in present tense, that they are executing Aldo Moro for crimes against the people. Then, silence. 4 days later, a phone call. A brigatista identifying himself as Dr. Nicolai places a call to Professor Franco Trito, an old friend of Aldo's. He tells him where to find the body. It's in a red Renault, parked on the street connecting the headquarters of the Christian Democrats to the Italian Communists. In the midst of an address from Zaccagnini affirming the hard line, the body of Aldo Moro is found less than 100 yards away. The Renault was a stolen vehicle that had been driven less than 15 kilometers since its theft, so wherever Moro had been kept was maddeningly near. Zaccagnini's speech is interrupted by a call from Interior Minister Cossiga. He tells the Christian Democrats the shocking news. Rumors shoot over to the communist headquarters, and Berlinguer goes out to his balcony. He sees the flashing police lights down the street, and knows it's true. The hammer and sickle are lowered to half-mast. A bomb squad isolates the Renault, but no explosives are found. A silent crowd watches as the trunk opens. A priest who knew Moro pushes his way to the front and relieves Moro's body of its mortal sins. It's May 9th, 1978, and the Moro Affair is over. Promptly, the government ignores the wishes of Moro and announces they will hold a state funeral. The Moro family, rejecting this notion, immediately asserts control over his body before the state can seize it. They plan a secret funeral on public payphones since their home's tapped, and they whisk their dead patriarch north to the village of Torrita Tiberina, where Aldo loved to vacation. When Eleonoro placed the call, the whole village went to work to prepare for the funeral. The family arrived amid hail and heavy rain. Eleonora did not cry, saying only, "Goodbye, Aldo." They came and left within 40 minutes. The men of power hosted a funeral for Moro with no body. The Pope, himself only 4 months from death, conducted the funeral for his old friend in the Basilica of St. John in Lateran. The family did not attend. The church was mostly empty except for those whom Moro considered to be his enemies. A fitting, if unwelcome, tribute to the memory of Aldo Moro could be found outside on the steps, where the flags of the Christian Democrats and the Italian Communists flew together. In the following months, the governing coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Communists fell apart, and the years of lead marched on. The Red Brigades lost whatever pull they once held on the public, and as they continued hitting targets without making any real political progress, their violence came to be seen as its own end. In the months after the affair, a journalist named Carmine Pecorelli made numerous shocking claims about the affair, including that the location of Moro's cell was known by the end of March, and that the kidnapping was orchestrated in collaboration with Operation Gladio and the CIA. Pecorelli, who was associated with the influential Propaganda Due Lodge, or P2, was murdered in Rome in 1979. Pecorelli is thought to have been in possession of a large trove of Moro letters when he died. Another set of the copies of these letters were discovered many years later, when hundreds of pages were discovered behind a false wall in an old Red Brigade's hideout in 1990. The death of Moro marked the start of the decline of the post-war ruling order. Proximity to the Red Brigade sent the Italian Communist Party into a slow, terminal decline. The historic compromise was the third way forward for the global communist movement that was already in decay, where the principles of Marx and Lenin were compromised in favor of the Socialist International. But the death of Moro kept Eurocommunism locked out of power forever. The Christian Democrats, no longer needed as this centralized bulwark against communism, saw its support ebb away to the smaller parties, and the Christian Democrats had made a martyr of Moro, but the discovery of the cache of Moro letters in 1990 revealed to the public that Moro essentially blamed his own party for his death, and it revealed the entirety of the contempt that he held for him in his last days. This was deeply damaging to Christian Democrats on its own, and then in 1992, the entire political structure collapsed under the revelations of Tangentopoli, a series of scandals and revelations that revealed the deep-seated corruption inherent in Italian politics. This saw the dissolution of all major political parties, a number of high-profile political arrests, and multiple suicides of implicated parliamentarians. Further generations of brigatistas came forward to replace those who died or, like Mario Moretti, were incarcerated in the years after the Moro Affair, but the global collapse of communism in the 1990s ultimately yielded the slow disappearance of the Red Brigades into the 2000s. Few brigatistas, even those sentenced for murder, faced very long prison sentences, and many like Moretti, Franceschini, and Curcio have been free for decades, just living as common members of the Italian public today. The Pope died shortly after Moro. Berlinguer died a few years later. Craxi had to flee internationally to escape arrest in 1994 for his role in scandals. In 2002, Andreotti was sentenced to 24 years in prison for ordering the murder of that journalist Carmine Pecorelli, but he was ultimately acquitted by the Italian Supreme Court of involvement in the murder the next year, and he died in 2013, leaving a mysterious and Machiavellian legacy. Almost half a century later, the nature of the Moro Affair is still unknown. Various conspiracy theories imply the involvement of any and all foreign powers, but no firm link between the Red Brigades and any international entities has ever been found, and no aspect of the affair necessarily requires any sort of foreign interference. Certainly, however, we can say that the interests of major foreign powers were served by the death of Moro. The architect of the historic compromise was gone, and the only historical attempt to bind together centrists and communists in governance was forever ended. The legacy of Aldo Moro is this: a quiet, eclectic man with no talent for oration, who nonetheless rose to power as a supreme coalition builder, weaving together disparate partnerships that defied history, who died a senseless death at the hands of misguided and rampantly violent idealists, left adrift by his powerful friends and allies. His blood, he foretold, would fall on all of them, and it did. In the weeks after the conclusion of the affair, on a wall in Rome, someone wrote, "Moro is dead, the Pope is sick, and I myself don't feel so well."